The Sonoran sun is a merciless god, and in the summer of 1882, it was poised to claim another soul. Her name was Olive Miller, a girl whose only sins were her innocence and her trust in the wrong man. Left to die with nothing but a tattered dress and a heart full of betrayal, her story should have ended there, a footnote in the dusty annals of the Arizona Territory. But fate, in its cruel and mysterious way, had other plans. It sent a savior she should have feared above all others, a Chiricahua Apache warrior, a man whose people were at war with hers. This isn't just a tale of survival. It's the story of how a single act of mercy in a godless land ignited a fire of vengeance that would threaten to burn a town to the ground. What happens when a lamb saved by a wolf learns to hunt? The dust of prosperity. Arizona was a character in itself. It was a fine reddish powder that coated everything. The unpainted clapboard of the buildings, the tired leaves of the cottonwood trees lining what was optimistically called Main Street, and the very souls of the people who lived there. For 17-year-old Olive Miller, it was the grit she tasted in her bread, and the film that settled on her future. Since her father, Thomas Miller, had succumbed to miner's lung 6 months prior, Olive's world had shrunk to the size of the small mortgaged homestead on the edge of town, and the pittance she earned mending clothes for the townsfolk. Thomas had been a dreamer, a geologist from back east, who had chased whispers of gold and silver all the way to this sun-scorched territory, only to find himself a failed farmer with a cough that rattled the window panes. He left Olive with 2 things: a deep-seated decency that was wholly unsuited for prosperity, and the deed to 100 acres of rock and scrub so worthless it was known locally as Miller's Folly. Olive was pretty in a way that seemed almost an apology, pale skin that the sun perpetually tried to punish, hair the color of corn silk, and wide blue eyes that held a heart-breaking naivety. In a town of hard-bitten prospectors, weary saloon girls and suspicious ranchers, her innocence was a flickering candle in a windstorm. She was a virgin, not out of piety, but out of a simple lack of opportunity and a shyness that kept her gaze fixed on the dusty boardwalks. Then Bartholomew Bart Higgins rode into town. He was everything the men of prosperity were not. He didn't have the calloused, dirt-caked hands of a miner, or the squint of a man who'd spent a lifetime staring at horizons. His hands were smooth. His smile was a flash of white in a tanned face, and his words were like cool water on a parched throat. He wore a tailored coat, a clean Stetson, and rode a handsome bay gelding. He claimed to be a land agent scouting opportunities for wealthy investors in Tucson. He first saw Olive in the general store, her brow furrowed in concentration as she tried to decide between buying flour or lard, knowing she couldn't afford both. Bart stepped in his voice a low, melodious baritone. "A woman as fair as yourself shouldn't be troubled by such worldly concerns," he'd said, placing a gold coin on the counter. "For you and for your pantry. Consider it an investment in this town's beauty." Olive, blushing to the roots of her hair, had tried to refuse, but his charm was a force of nature. He began a methodical courtship that left the town and Olive herself breathless. He brought her licorice sticks from the mercantile, read poetry to her on the porch of her small cabin as the sun bled across the Dragoon Mountains, and spoke of a life far from the dust and despair of prosperity. He talked of San Francisco, of grand hotels, and ocean breezes of a world where a lady like her would be adorned in silks, not mending them. "This place, it's a cage for a songbird like you, Olive," he'd murmur, his thumb gently tracing her jawline. "I want to give you the sky." To Olive, who had only ever known the cage, his words were a gospel. She fell for him completely and utterly. She ignored the skeptical glances of Martha, the saloon owner, whose cynical heart had seen 100 men like Bart Higgins. She dismissed the gruff warnings of Sheriff Brody, a man who trusted a rattlesnake more than a smooth talker. "He's just a peacock," Abby Brody had told her one afternoon. "All flash and feathers, but hollow inside. Men like that don't come to a place like this without wanting something." But Olive was deaf to it. Love, or what she believed was love, was a fever. The object of Bart's desire was, of course, Miller's folly. He'd learned of it from loose talk in the saloon. While others laughed at the worthless plot, Bart had made it his business to know things others didn't. He knew Thomas Miller wasn't just a farmer. He was a trained geologist. Bart suspected the old man knew something that his folly wasn't a folly at all. One evening under a canopy of stars, so bright they seemed to hum, Bart proposed. He didn't have a ring, he explained with a charming self-deprecation. He'd have one custom-made for her in Tucson, a diamond as clear and bright as her eyes. "We'll leave this place, Olive," he said, his voice thick with sincerity. "We'll get married by a proper judge in Tucson. We'll sell my holdings here and your father's land. And with that money, we'll start our new life. A real life." The selling of her father's land gave Olive a pang of guilt. It was all she had left of him. But what was it worth compared to a future with Bart? To make it easier, Bart continued smoothly, "You should sign the deed over to me. As your fiancé and business partner, I can handle the filing and the sale in Tucson without you having to deal with all that legal nonsense. We'll register it as a joint asset once we're wed. It's just a formality." It was the serpent offering the apple, and Olive, starved for a taste of paradise, took a bite. The next day, in the dusty office of a notary who was a friend of Bart's, she signed the document. Her hand trembled as she wrote Olive Miller, her signature the final act of a girl who was about to be erased. They left 2 days later, just after dawn. Olive had packed her few belongings in a small carpet bag. She wore her best dress, a simple blue calico. She looked back at the small cabin one last time, a tear tracing a clean path through the dust on her cheek. It was a tear of sorrow for the past, but also one of joy for the future. They rode east towards the rising sun. Bart was attentive and cheerful for the first day, pointing out landmarks and telling her stories of his supposed travels. They were heading for the pass through the Chiricahua Mountains, a more direct but more dangerous route to the eastern plains and the roads to Tucson. The change came on the second day. The landscape had grown harsher, the saguaros replaced by jagged rocks and thorny ocotillo. The sun was a physical weight. Bart's smiles became less frequent, his words shorter. He pushed the pace, and Olive's small mare struggled to keep up. By midday, they stopped in the shade of a rock outcropping that offered little relief. The heat shimmered off the ground, distorting the world into a hoary illusion. "I'm so thirsty, Bart," Olive said, her voice raspy. Bart dismounted and walked over to her. He didn't offer her the canteen. He unstrapped her own nearly empty one from her saddle. His smile was gone, replaced by an expression she'd never seen before, a cold, appraising emptiness. It was the face of a stranger. "Bart." "What is it?" she asked, a knot of fear tightening in her stomach. "The journey ends here for you, Olive," he said, his voice flat. He took her carpet bag and opened it, rummaging through her meager possessions. He found what he was looking for, a small leather-bound journal of her father's, filled with geological notes and hand-drawn maps that Olive had thought were just sentimental scribbles. He tucked it into his own saddlebag, along with the deed. The world seemed to tilt. What? What are you talking about? We're going to Tucson. To be married. He laughed. It was not the warm, charming laugh she knew. It was a cruel, sharp sound that echoed off the rocks. Married, you foolish little girl. Did you really think a man like me would saddle himself with a dusty, penniless waif like you? The words struck her with the force of a physical blow. But you said you loved me. I said what you needed to hear. He sneered, his eyes flicking over her with utter disdain. Your father wasn't a fool, just unlucky. He knew there was silver on that folly of his. A rich vein, according to his notes. And you, my dear, you just signed it all over to me. He swung himself back onto his horse. The handsome bay gelding seemed monstrous now, an instrument of her doom. You can't just leave me here, she cried, scrambling to her feet. There's no water, I'll die. That's the idea, he said, looking down at her as if she were an insect. No body, no questions, just a silly girl who ran off and got lost. Happens all the time. He paused, a wicked glimmer in his eye. Don't worry. I'll be thinking of you while I'm spending your fortune in San Francisco. I'll even toast to your innocence. He spat the last word, turned his horse, and spurred it into a canter, not once looking back. Olive stood paralyzed, watching him disappear into the shimmering heat. The sound of his horse's hooves faded, replaced by the deafening silence of the desert. She was alone. The blue calico dress, her finest, was now her shroud. The serpent had slithered back to his hole, and paradise had become a sun-bleached hell. The betrayal was so absolute, so complete, it felt like the world itself had cracked open, swallowing her whole. She let out a scream, but the sound was swallowed by the vast, indifferent expanse of the Sonoran desert. The first few hours were a blur of panicked disbelief. Olive ran. She ran in the direction Bart had disappeared, her feet sinking into the hot sand, the hem of her dress catching on thorns. She called his name until her throat was raw, the sound a pathetic plea against the vastness. But there was only the mocking caw of a distant raven and the oppressive weight of the sun. Reality sank in with the cruelty of a slow-acting poison. The sun climbed to its zenith, beating down on her unprotected head. Her world shrank to a desperate, primal calculus thirst heat, and the ever-dwindling reserve of her own strength. She stumbled back to the rock outcropping, the only landmark in a sea of desolation, and huddled in its meager shade. The rock was hot to the touch, offering no comfort. By late afternoon, the thirst was a living thing inside her, a creature with claws scraping at her throat. Her tongue felt thick and swollen in her mouth. She thought of water, the cool, clean water from the well. Back home, the murky water in the horse trough, even the stale, warm water in the canteen Bart had taken. The memories were a form of torture. As the sun began to set, painting the sky in brutal strokes of orange and purple, a new fear arrived with the cooling air, the night. The desert wasn't empty. She'd heard the stories of coyotes, mountain lions, and rattlesnakes, and of the Apache, the Chiricahua, the ghost people of the mountains. The tales told in prosperity were of bloodthirsty savages who killed settlers without mercy. Sheriff Brody had led a posse after a raiding party just last spring. The fear of them was a constant low hum in the territory. Olive huddled against the rock, shivering despite the residual heat. Every snap of a twig, every rustle of a bush sent a jolt of terror through her. She was a child again, afraid of the monsters under her bed. Only now, the monsters were real, and the world was their domain. She survived the night, drifting in and out of a restless, feverish sleep. The dawn brought no relief, only the promise of another day of torment. Her blue dress was torn and stained, her face blistered by the sun. Delirium began to set in. She saw mirages, shimmering lakes that vanished as she crawled toward them, a vision of her father beckoning from a distant ridge. She spoke to him, her voice a cracked whisper, apologizing for giving away his land. By the second day, she was no longer walking but crawling. The will to live had been burned down to a single stubborn ember. She knew she was dying. Her final coherent thought was one of bitter irony. Bart had promised her a new life, and in a way he had delivered. This agonizing crawl through the furnace of the desert was a world away from the dust of prosperity. She collapsed, her face pressed into the hot, gritty sand. The world dissolved into a haze of blinding white light and buzzing silence. The ember was about to be extinguished. That was when a shadow fell over her. She didn't have the strength to lift her head. Through cracked eyelids, she saw a pair of high-topped moccasins beaded in a simple pattern, standing inches from her face. Her heart gave a final, panicked flutter. An Apache. Her worst fear realized at the very end. Slowly, her gaze traveled up. Deerskin leggings, a breechcloth, a leather belt holding a sheathed knife, and an ammunition pouch. His chest was bare, the copper skin scarred and lean with muscle. A Winchester rifle was held loosely in one hand. His face was framed by long black hair, held back by a simple cloth band. His features were sharp, angular, a strong jaw, a prominent nose, and eyes as dark and unreadable as obsidian. He was not the leering demon of the settlers' tales. He was simply a man, and his expression was one of grim assessment. This was Kyle. He had been tracking a small herd of pronghorn when he saw the glint of something unnatural against the landscape, the pale blue of Olive's dress. His first instinct was caution. A white woman, alone and on foot, was an anomaly, and anomalies in this land were often traps. He had watched her from a ridge for nearly an hour, his eyes missing nothing. Her stumbling gait, her lack of water or a horse, the clear signs of heat stroke and dehydration. He saw no posse, no ambush. He saw only a person at the edge of death. His people, the Chiricahua, were being squeezed from all sides. The Pindalikoye, the White Eyes, had taken their lands, killed their game, and broken every promise. His own family had been lost in a raid on their rancheria by soldiers from Fort Bowie. Vengeance and hatred were hot coals in his gut. This girl was one of them. Leaving her to the sun would be a small, silent justice. It was the logical thing to do. But as he stood over her, he saw not a symbol of his enemy. He saw the blistered skin, the cracked lips bleeding into the sand, the pathetic torn state of her dress. He saw the trail she had crawled, a desperate signature of suffering etched into the earth. There was no threat here. There was only misery. His leader, Cochise, had sometimes spoken of a greater wisdom, one that could see beyond the color of a person's skin to the spirit within. Kyle had always considered it a philosophy for times of peace, but looking at Olive, he felt an unwilling stirring of something other than hate. He saw a shared vulnerability to the harshness of the land. He knelt. Olive flinched, a tiny, involuntary movement. She expected the flash of a knife, the end. Instead, a hand, calloused and surprisingly gentle, touched her forehead. It was a clinical touch, assessing her fever. Kyle grunted softly. She was close to the edge. He unslung a canteen from his shoulder, not a metal one, but one made from a hollowed gourd, cool to the touch. He uncorked it, and lifting her head with one arm, brought it to her lips. "Tu," he said. Water. The first touch of water on her lips was a miracle. It was life. She drank greedily, choking and sputtering, but he was patient, letting her take only small sips. The water was cool and tasted faintly of earth and minerals. It was the most wonderful thing she had ever tasted. When she had drunk enough, he lowered her head gently back to the ground. He looked at her for a long moment, his dark eyes searching her face. Olive stared back, her delirious mind, struggling to process what was happening. This man, who should have been her killer, was saving her. Why, Kyle knew he couldn't leave her. To save her life, only to abandon her again, would be a cruelty worse than simply ignoring her. It was an obligation now. With a sigh of resignation, he made his decision. He was a warrior, not a nursemaid, but he would not let her die. With an ease that belied her dead weight, he lifted her into his arms. Olive was limp, her head lolling against his shoulder. Her world was a dizzying swirl of motion, the smell of leather sweat and the faint, clean scent of sage. She blacked out before he had taken 10 steps. He carried her to a hidden camp, a small shelter nestled in a rock canyon she would never have found. A small, clear spring trickled from the rocks, feeding a patch of green grass. It was a secret place, an oasis of life in the middle of death. He laid her on a soft deerskin blanket in the shade. For the next 3 days, Kyle tended to her. He bathed her feverish face with cool water. He mashed edible roots into a thin gruel and fed it to her bit by bit. He applied a salve of ground herbs to her sunburned skin, the touch of his fingers impersonal and efficient. Olive drifted in and out of consciousness. In her lucid moments, she would watch him. He moved with a silent, fluid grace, a part of the landscape itself. He rarely spoke, and when he did, it was in his own language, soft sounds that she didn't understand. Yet there was a communication in his actions. He was patient, methodical, and utterly focused on her survival. The fear slowly receded, replaced by a profound and overwhelming sense of confusion and gratitude. She had been betrayed by a man who spoke her language and promised her love. She was being skinned by a man whose people were her enemies, a man with whom she shared no words. On the 4th day, she woke up, and her mind was clear. The fever was gone. The world was sharp and in focus. She sat up feeling weak but alive. Kyle was sitting across the small camp, sharpening his knife on a whetstone. He looked up, his expression unchanging. Her throat was still sore, but she had to speak. Why, she whispered the single word, a croak. Kyle stopped his work. He looked at her, his dark eyes holding hers for a long moment. He didn't know the words to explain his complex motivations, the memory of his own family's suffering, the unexpected pang of empathy, the warrior's code that forbade leaving a helpless being to a dishonorable death. So he gave her the simplest truth. He pointed a finger at her, then at himself. He then swept his hand out to indicate the vast, harsh desert around them. He said one word in the guttural Apache tongue, a word that needed no translation. Nde. People. We are people. In that moment, a fragile, unspoken bridge was built between 2 worlds in the heart of the Sonoran Desert. For Olive Miller, it was the beginning of a transformation she could never have imagined. She had been left for dead, as a weak and foolish girl. She was being reborn in the care of a man who saw not her race or her gender, but her will to survive. The days that followed settled into a quiet routine, a silent dance of survival and healing. Olive's strength returned slowly. At first, she could only sit and watch as Kyle went about his tasks. He would disappear for hours, returning with a rabbit or a handful of prickly pear fruit. He showed her how to roast agave hearts in a pit of hot stones until they were sweet and tender, and how to find water by watching the flight of birds. Language was the great barrier between them. They communicated through a pigeon of gestures, single words, and drawings in the sand. He taught her the Apache words for the essentials: tu water gan, bread; food, chaghashe, danger. She in turn taught him their English equivalents. A quiet respect grew in the space between their languages. He respected her resilience, the stubborn spark of life that had refused to be extinguished. She revered his competence, his profound connection to a land that had almost killed her. She learned his name, Kyle, repeating it until the sound felt natural on her tongue. He learned hers, his pronunciation clipped and guttural Abigail. One afternoon, as she sat watching him fletch an arrow, the full weight of her situation crashed down on her again. It wasn't just about survival anymore. Bart Higgins had her deed. He had her father's journal. He was going to steal her inheritance, the only thing her father had managed to leave her. A cold, hard anger, an emotion she had never truly felt before, began to smolder beneath her gratitude. She had to make Kyle understand. She picked up a stick and smoothed a patch of sand. She drew a crude square. "Prosperity," she said, pointing to it. Then she drew a small rectangle nearby. "My koa, house." She had learned the word from him. She then drew a larger, shapeless area. "Miller's Folly, my land." Kyle watched his eyes narrowed in concentration. She drew a stick figure of herself, then one of a man. "Bart," she said, her voice laced with a venom that surprised her. She drew a heart between them, then crossed it out violently. She mimed signing a paper, then handed an imaginary document to the stick figure Bart. She drew him on a horse riding away, and then drew herself lying on the ground, pointing to the sun. Kyle's expression darkened. He understood betrayal. It was a language his people knew fluently. Olive wasn't finished. She remembered a small, peculiar rock her father had always kept on his desk, a sample from the land. She had tucked it into a small pocket of her dress for sentimental reasons, before she left, one of the few things Bart had overlooked. She pulled it out now. It was a dull, grayish quartz, but it was threaded with fine, dark veins of what looked like tarnished metal. She held it out to Kyle. He took it, his fingers surprisingly gentle. He turned it over his thumb, rubbing away the grime. He held it up to the light, his gaze sharp and intense. A flicker of recognition crossed his features. He had seen rock like this before. He looked from the rock in his hand to the map she had drawn in the sand, his eyes locking onto the area she had labeled Miller's Folly. He stood up and walked to the edge of their canyon, looking out towards the distant, hazy peaks of the Dragoon Mountains. He was silent for a long time. When he returned, his demeanor had changed. There was a new intensity in his eyes, a purpose that hadn't been there before. He took the stick and drew on the sand beside her map. He drew mountains and a canyon, a place within the boundaries of her land. He drew a symbol there, a spiral, a sacred place. Then he spoke, using a mix of Apache, the few English words he knew, and powerful gestures. He told her a story, his story. The man who had stolen her land was working for a bigger man, a Nantan Lupan, a grey wolf chief, a white man from Tucson named Harrison Croft. Croft was a cattle baron who was swallowing up land all across the territory using men like Bart Higgins as his jackals. Croft's men, a brutal gang of hired guns, led by a vicious foreman named Cordell, were responsible for the raid that had killed Kyle wife and son. They had attacked his village not for plunder, but for the land it was on land adjacent to Miller's Folly. They had desecrated the sacred Canyon of the Spirits, the place he had marked with a spiral believing it to be cursed. But Kyle and the elders of his tribe knew it wasn't cursed. It was blessed. The dark-veined rock, the besh en tlishi, the blue, shining metal, was a gift from the mountain spirits. Silver. The pieces clicked into place for Olive with dizzying speed. Her father had known. Bart hadn't just stolen a piece of worthless land. He had stolen a silver mine. And this crime was entangled with the murder of Kyle's family. Their separate tragedies were two threads from the same poisoned spool woven by the same hands Bart Higgins and his master Harrison Croft. In that moment, everything changed. Olive was no longer a victim to be pitied. Kyle was no longer just her savior. They were allies bound by a common enemy and a shared desire for justice. "Help me," she said, her voice steady and clear. "Help me get it back." Kyle looked at her, truly, seeing her for the first time. He saw not the helpless girl he had found in the desert, but a woman with fire in her eyes. This was no longer just about mercy. This was about vengeance. For his family. For his people. For her. He nodded once. "Hago, let's go." But he knew she couldn't go back to prosperity as she was. The world outside this canyon would eat her alive. The lamb had to learn the ways of the wolf. Her training began the next day. It was a brutal education. He taught her to move silently to place her feet so as not to snap a twig or dislodge a stone. He taught her to read the tracks in the dirt, to know the difference between a deer and a shod horse. He made her climb rock faces until her fingers were raw and bleeding, teaching her to trust her own strength. He taught her about hunger and patience. They would lie in wait for hours, motionless, for a single rabbit to wander into their snare. He was a demanding teacher, offering no praise, only a grunt of acknowledgement when she did something correctly. Finally, he taught her to fight. Not with her fists, she was no match for a grown man. He taught her to use the weapons of the weak surprise distance and a deadly aim. He started her with a bow he crafted from a length of mulberry wood. Day after day, she practiced her arms, aching her fingers raw from the bowstring until she could consistently hit a target the size of a man's chest from 50 paces. Then he gave her his rifle. The Winchester felt heavy and alien in her hands. The first time she fired it, the recoil slammed into her shoulder, knocking her to the ground. The ringing in her ears was deafening. She got up her shoulder, throbbing, tears of frustration in her eyes. Kyle stood over her, his face impassive. "Ach-i," he said. Again. So she did it again, and again, and again. She learned to seat the stock properly in her shoulder, to control her breathing, to squeeze the trigger instead of jerking it. The bruises on her shoulder bloomed in shades of purple and yellow, but slowly her aim improved. The fear of the weapon was replaced by a sense of its power. This piece of metal which had brought so much death to Kyle's people was now her only hope for justice. Weeks passed. The sun and the hardship stripped away the last of the soft, naive girl from prosperity. Her skin tanned to a golden brown. Her hands became calloused. Her body, once soft, was now lean and wiry. Her corn silk hair was often tied back with a leather thong. But the greatest change was in her eyes. The wide, trusting blue had been replaced by a focused, flinty gaze. She had looked into the face of death and betrayal, and had been reborn in the crucible of the desert. She had been a lamb, lost and bleating. Now she was learning to think like the hawk that circled overhead, patient, watchful, and deadly. One evening, as they shared a meal of roasted quail, Kyle looked at her. He saw the transformation. He saw the rifle resting comfortably beside her. He knew she was ready. "Prosperity," he said. Olive nodded, her jaw set. It was time to return. Not as the girl who had fled, but as a spectre of vengeance rising from the desert grave they had dug for her. Returning to Prosperity was like entering a photograph of a former life. Under the cover of a moonless night, Olive and Kyle slipped past the sleeping town and into the dark, silent shell of her father's cabin. The familiar space felt alien now, haunted by the ghost of the naive girl she had been. For Olive, this was no longer home. It was a forward operating base in enemy territory. While she remained hidden, Kyle became a spirit in the hills. He would vanish before dawn and return after dusk, a shadow bearing vital intelligence. His scouting confirmed their fears. Harrison Croft's men had established a large, well-armed survey camp near Miller's Folly. The operation was led by Cordell, the brutal foreman whose face was seared into Kyle's memory, and strutting among the hired guns was Bart Higgins, enjoying the spoils of his treachery. Most importantly, Kyle learned their timeline. Nantan Lupan. Croft. Comes in 2 weeks, he reported, his voice a low growl. Brings mining machines, more men. The clock was ticking. They needed more information, and only Olive could get it. She couldn't enter town as herself. She was presumed dead, a ghost Bart had created to cover his crime. So Olive decided to embrace the role. She took a pair of rusty scissors and sheared off her long corn silk hair, leaving it short and ragged. Using soot from the cold fireplace, she smudged her face, creating hollows beneath her eyes and cheekbones, burying the pretty girl from Prosperity beneath a mask of grime and hardship. Dressed in her torn and stained calico, she was no one, just another desperate soul clinging to the edges of the territory. Her destination was the saloon. It was the town's beating heart, where secrets flowed as freely as cheap whiskey. Keeping her head down in a dark corner, she nursed a beer and listened. It didn't take long to hear the story Bart had spun. A pity about that Miller girl, a prospector said at the bar. Sheriff Brody figures she'd just wandered off into the desert after that fancy fella Higgins threw her over. Higgins says she was flighty, another man added. Either way, he came out smelling like a rose. Sold that worthless plot of her pa's to Croft's company. Smart man. The casual injustice of it was a hot brand on her soul. Bart had not only left her for dead, but had also murdered her reputation, painting her as a fool who'd gotten herself killed. The anger that rose in her was cold and sharp. Her reverie was broken when Martha, the saloon's shrewd owner, slid into the chair opposite her. "Ain't seen you around before, Kid Martha," said, her eyes missing nothing. "You look like you've been through a ringer." "Just passing through," Olive mumbled, keeping her face shadowed. Martha's gaze lingered. "You've got familiar eyes," she said slowly. "Remind me of someone. That poor Miller girl." Olive's heart hammered against her ribs. She stood abruptly, tossed a coin on the table, and walked out without another word, feeling Martha's stare burning into her back. She recounted the close call to Kael that night. He was not troubled. It was a necessary risk. But her report from the saloon confirmed their thinking. A simple theft of the deed was no longer enough. They couldn't erase the lies or stop a man like Croft with a single piece of paper. "They are a sickness," Kael said, his hand resting on the stock of his rifle. "You do not ask a sickness to leave. You cut it out." Olive met his gaze, her own resolve hardening. She understood. They had to dismantle Croft's entire operation from the inside out. They would turn the desert superstitions and the inherent greed of the hired guns against them. They would become the ghosts the townsfolk already feared. The psychological war began that night. Kael became the phantom of the Dragoon Mountains. A sentry's horse would vanish from its picket line, only to be found miles away. A cache of supplies would be found, spoiled, their water barrels mysteriously drained. He used his bow to send arrows, fletched with black feathers, a terrifying symbol to those who knew Apache lore, thudding into the posts of the camp. They carried no message, their silence more menacing than any written threat. Fear began to curdle the camp's morale. The hired guns had signed on for easy money, not to be haunted by a spirit they could not see. Their vigilance frayed, replaced by drink and paranoia. While Kael worked on their nerves, Olive targeted their trust. Disguised again, she went to the general store when she knew some of Cordell's men would be there. As they complained about the phantom haunting the hills, Olive, the anonymous drifter, added her own poison to the pot. "Ghosts ain't what you should worry about," she said, her voice a low, raspy drawl that carried across the store. "It's the living you gotta watch. Heard that fancy man Higgins has been talking to folks from a rival mining company. A man like that plays all sides against the middle. He'll sell you all out for a better offer." It was a complete fabrication, but in the atmosphere of terror, Kael had cultivated the seed of doubt found fertile ground. The idea that Higgins, the slick outsider, was a traitor felt plausible. The rumor spread through the camp like a fever. Cordell began to watch Bart with open suspicion, and Bart's defensive arrogance only fueled the crew's mistrust. The foundation of Croft's enterprise, built on greed and fear, was beginning to crack under its own weight. In the dark cabin, Olive and Kael knew their strategy was working. They were no longer the hunted. They were the hunters, orchestrating a storm of fear and suspicion. They had frayed the enemy's nerves and planted the seeds of their destruction. Now all they had to do was wait for Harrison Croft to walk into the trap. The day Harrison Croft was scheduled to arrive, the air over Prosperity was thick with anticipation. For Olive and Kael, it was the precipice of their desperate gamble. Their plan was to turn the desert, the instrument of her intended death, into their greatest weapon. Their stage was the narrow entrance to the main canyon on Miller's Folly, the future site of Croft's silver mine. The night before, they worked under a sliver of moon, their movements a silent, practiced dance. Kael, with his innate understanding of the rock, had identified an unstable overhang, a ton of stone held in place by a few key boulders. It was perilous work, using scavenged pry bars to weaken the supports, every move risking a premature collapse. They packed the crevices with blasting powder Kael had quietly acquired from the mining camp, running a long fuse down to a hidden alcove. The trap was set. It was designed not to kill, but to unleash the mountain's fury, to terrify and to block. As Kael finalized their trap, Olive played her own hand. She sent a carefully worded anonymous letter to the U.S. Marshal's office in Tucson, delivered by a freight driver she paid with her last coin. It spoke of Harrison Croft, illegal mining and armed intimidation, alluding to the presence of a wanted man, to ensure the law would ride fast. It was a long shot, a faith-based play that the law might arrive to witness the chaos they planned to unleash. As dawn broke, they took their positions. Kyle was hidden high on the canyon rim, near the fuse, his Winchester resting beside him. Olive was concealed on the opposite side, armed with Kyle's bow and her father's Colt Peacemaker, tucked in her waistband. From their perches, the entire canyon was laid out before them like a map. By mid-morning, a dust cloud signaled Croft's approach. He arrived in a fine carriage, flanked by outriders, the very picture of arrogant conquest. From the mining camp, Foreman Cordell and his men rode out to greet their patron among them, a beaming Bart Higgins, dressed in his finest suit. The entire procession, swelled with triumph, rode toward the canyon. As they entered the narrow pass, the high walls amplifying the sound of their horses, Kyle gave Olive a slight nod. It was time. Olive drew her bowstring, the motion fluid, and sure. She didn't aim for a man. She aimed for the lead horse of Croft's carriage. The arrow flew true, striking the animal in its thick neck. It wasn't a fatal shot, but the shock and pain were immediate. The horse screamed and reared, throwing the carriage team into chaos. Men shouted in confusion, drawing their pistols and scanning the empty cliffs. Ambush Cordell roared. At that exact moment, Kyle touched the flame to the fuse. The explosion was a deep, guttural roar that seemed to come from the mountain's very core. The keystone boulders shattered. With a deafening, grinding thunder, the entire rock overhang gave way. A wave of stone and dust crashed down onto the trail, a force of nature unleashed. The air filled with a choking brown cloud. Horses bolted, men screamed, and Croft's fine carriage was half buried under the rock slide, its axle snapped. The attack was a masterpiece of psychological warfare. In seconds, a triumphant parade had become a dust-choked nightmare. The superstitions Kyle and Olive had nurtured the phantom raids. The whispers of a curse now seemed terrifyingly real. Kyle fired his rifle from the rim, not to kill, but to direct the panic. A bullet whined off a rock near Cordell's head. Another splintered a guard's saddle. It was all the proof the hired guns needed. They weren't fighting men. They were fighting a vengeful spirit. Their nerve broke completely. Led by a terrified Cordell, they spurred their horses and fled, a full-blown rout of men who had signed on to guard a mine, not to die in a cursed canyon. On the other side of the slide, a furious Harrison Croft was trapped with only a handful of his personal guards. But Olive's focus was elsewhere. In the initial chaos, Bart Higgins had not fled. He had sprinted back to the main office tent, his greed overriding his fear. He burst out, clutching a leather satchel, his prize, the deed and maps, and ran straight into Olive as she descended from the rim. He stopped dead, his face a mask of disbelief and terror. He saw the ragged hair, the sun-browned skin, and the cold fire in her eyes. It was Olive, but an Olive forged in hell. "You," he breathed. "Hello, Bart," she said, her voice steady and low. She raised the Colt Peacemaker, its muzzle aimed at his heart. "Looking for this, Olive. It's not what you think," he stammered, clutching the satchel to his chest. "I know exactly what it is," she said, taking a deliberate step closer. "You left me to die for the contents of that bag. Now you're going to give it to me." A flicker of his old arrogance returned. "Never. It's mine." As the word left his lips, a shadow detached itself from the rocks behind him. Kyle moved with utter silence, a phantom made real. Before Bart could even register his presence, Kyle's hand shot out, wrenching the satchel from his grasp, while his other hand pressed the cold, flat steel of his knife against Bart's throat. Bart froze, a pathetic whimper caught in his throat. Kyle handed the satchel to Olive. She opened it and pulled out the deed to Miller's Folly and her father's journal. She had her life and her legacy back in her hands. She looked at Bart, the man she once thought she loved, and felt nothing but a cold, clear contempt. He was just a coward stripped of his charm. "You don't get to die," she told him, her voice like chipping ice. "You get to live with being nothing." Just then, new riders appeared, a posse from town. At its head were Sheriff Brody and a stern-faced man, wearing the silver star of a U.S. Marshal. Olive's letter had arrived. "By God, Olive!" Sheriff Brody yelled, his eyes wide with shock. "It's you!" Kyle melted back into the shadows of the rocks, vanishing as if he were never there. Olive holstered her pistol and stood her ground as the lawmen rode into the scene of chaos. Before the stunned marshal, she told her story of the betrayal, the theft, the attempt on her life. She presented the deed and her father's journal as proof. The illegal mining camp, the terrified testimonies of the captured guards, and the furious, trapped Harrison Croft told the rest of the tale. Justice, when it came, was swift. Croft and his foreman Cordell were arrested for a litany of crimes, and Bart Higgins, his fine suit covered in the dust of his ruin, was led away in irons, a hollow man who had lost everything. Olive stood tall amidst the wreckage, the desert sun on her face, no longer a victim, but the architect of a storm that had brought justice to the godless land. Prosperity awoke from the nightmare of Harrison Croft to find a new reality. Olive Miller, the girl they had buried in gossip, was now its silent ruler. Her father's silver bought her power, but it was the memory of the desert that earned her respect. She ran her new mining empire with a firm, fair hand, and used her wealth to heal the town. But through it all, one question haunted her. Where was the Apache? Her victory felt hollow without the man who had forged it with her. Kyle had vanished back into the mountains, a ghost once more. Leaving her new life behind, Olive rode out alone, letting the instincts he had taught her guide her deep into the Dragoon Mountains. She found his sign, a single black feather, resting on a rock, and she waited. He came with the dusk, no longer a lone tracker, but a leader flanked by 2 warriors. In the fading light, he looked like a chief. "I came to thank you," she said, her voice thick with emotion, as she offered him a heavy pouch of gold. "This is your share." Kyle merely shook his head, his eyes on her, not the gold. "My payment was justice. The spirits of my family can rest. That is my share." His refusal was absolute, making her offer feel small and foreign. "Then what can I give you?" she asked, her voice a whisper. "You have already given it," he replied, his gaze sweeping over the strong, self-assured woman before him. "You learned the mountain's heart. Do not forget it." In the quiet between them, the unspoken truth settled. He was a bridge for his people. She was a leader for hers. Their paths, once joined in violence and survival, now had to diverge. A life together was an impossible dream in a world not yet ready for them. "Will I see you again?" she whispered, the question hanging in the cool night air. Kyle looked up at the vast starry sky that covered them both. "We live under the same sky, Abigail. We breathe the same air. We are never truly apart. He stepped forward, and for the first time his touch was not practical or clinical. He gently brushed her cheek in a gesture of profound, respectful farewell. Then he turned, mounted his horse, and without looking back, rode into the deepening twilight with his warriors. Olive watched until he was gone, a silhouette against the stars. There was no sorrow, only a profound peace. A poor virgin girl was left to die in the desert, but an Apache warrior had not just saved her. He had not just given her back her life. He had shown her its true worth. She turned her horse towards home, a queen in a kingdom of dust and silver, forever carrying the spirit of the mountain in her heart. And so Olive Miller's story became a legend in the Arizona Territory. It wasn't a simple tale of revenge, but a testament to the incredible resilience of the human spirit. It reminds us that our deepest betrayals can sometimes lead to our greatest transformations, and that allies can be found in the most unexpected places. The bond forged in the desert furnace between Olive and Kael was a quiet rebellion against the hatred of their time, a bridge built not of wood or stone, but of mutual respect and shared survival. If this story of a woman who rose from her own grave to reclaim her destiny moved you, please let us know in the comments below. What part of Olive's transformation resonated with you the most? Don't forget to hit that like button. If you enjoyed this journey into the Wild West, share this video with someone who loves a powerful story of justice and survival. And most importantly, subscribe to our channel and ring that notification bell so you never miss another true tale from the untamed frontier. Thank you for listening.